The flashlight beam shakes. Not because the hand holding it is weak, but because the woman holding it has just realized the wall in front of her is breathing. Not literally, but close enough that her chest tightens the same way. There's a draft coming from somewhere that shouldn't have a somewhere. A thin, cold thread of air slipping out from behind a bookshelf that has not moved in 60 years, curling against her ankles like it's been waiting for her, specifically, to come home. Claire Donnelly presses her palm flat against the old oak panel behind the shelf, and the wood gives. Not much. An inch, maybe less. But wood that's been nailed shut for 60 years should not give at all. Somewhere above her, in a house she inherited 3 days ago from a grandmother she barely knew, a floorboard creaks. She is alone. She checked. She is certain she is alone. And yet. She leans closer to the gap in the wall, and the smell hits her first, old paper, dust, and underneath it, faint but unmistakable, something sweet and waxy and wrong. Cosmetics. Decades-old lipstick, the kind that turns the color of dried blood when it oxidizes. She presses her eye to the crack in the wood. And somewhere in the dark on the other side, something pale moves. This is the story of what Claire Donnelly found beneath Ashworth Manor, and why, 62 years ago, an entire town agreed, without ever saying a word to each other, to forget that a woman named Eleanor Ashworth ever existed at all. Stay with me. Because by the end of this, you will never look at an old house, or an old lipstick, the same way again. Autumn, 2024. The town of Marrow Hollow, Vermont, population 2,600 and shrinking, is the kind of place where everyone knows your name and exactly half of what you're hiding. Claire Donnelly had not set foot in Marrow Hollow in 11 years. She left at 23 with a half-finished cosmetology degree and a promise to herself that she would never come back to the town that made her feel, even as a child, like she was being watched by something behind the wallpaper. She built a life in Boston restoring antique cosmetics for museums and private collectors, a strange, delicate profession that required equal parts chemistry, history, and patience. She could tell you the difference between a 1940s lipstick and a 1960s one just by the way it cracked when you twisted the tube. She could date a powder compact within 5 years just from the rust pattern on its hinge. It was quiet work. Careful work. Work that asked nothing of her except attention. It suited her, because Claire had spent most of her life trying very hard not to be noticed. The call came on a Tuesday. A lawyer named Philip Renner, voice dry as a courtroom, informing her that her grandmother, Vivian Ashworth, had passed away in her sleep at the age of 81, and that Claire, to her considerable shock, was the sole heir to her estate, which consisted primarily of one item, a 32-room Gothic revival mansion on the edge of Marrow Hollow known locally as Ashworth Manor. Claire had not known her grandmother owned a mansion. Claire had not known her grandmother at all, not really. Vivian had been a name on a Christmas card twice a decade, a photograph in a drawer, a woman her mother referred to only as complicated before changing the subject. They had not spoken in 15 years. Claire had not even been certain, until the phone call, that Vivian was still alive. She left specific instructions, the lawyer told her over a bad phone connection. The house is to go to you, and only you. Nothing is to be sold, donated, or altered until you have personally walked through every room. That's an odd request, Claire said. Mrs. Ashworth was an odd woman, Renner replied, and something in the way he said it made Claire's neck prickle, even 300 miles away. She drove up on a gray Thursday, GPS losing signal twice in the last 11 miles, the trees pressing closer to the road the deeper she went, until finally the canopy broke and there it was, Ashworth Manor, rising out of the mist like something that had grown there instead of being built. 3 stories of dark stone and ivy, windows like dozens of watching eyes, a wraparound porch sagging gently under the weight of decades. It was beautiful in the way a held breath is beautiful. You keep waiting for it to be released. An elderly man was waiting on the porch steps when she pulled up, tall, stooped, wearing a flannel jacket that looked older than Claire herself. He introduced himself as Walter Greer, the groundskeeper, and said he'd worked the property for longer than you've been breathing, miss. His handshake was firm. His eyes did not quite meet hers. Your grandmother was a private woman, Walter said, leading her up the steps. Kept to herself. Kept the house to herself, mostly. There's parts of it she never let anybody into. Not even me, and I've cut this lawn for 58 years. Which parts? Claire asked. Walter's jaw tightened. The east wing's been locked since before you were born. She had her reasons, I'm sure. Claire would think about that sentence many times over the following weeks. She had her reasons, I'm sure, the careful neutrality of it. The way Walter said it like a man stepping around a hole in the floor he'd memorized the shape of. That first night, Claire walked the ground floor with a flashlight because half the fuses had blown and nobody had thought to call an electrician in what looked like a decade. The furniture was draped in white sheets like a house of ghosts mid-haunting. Portraits lined the main hallway, their painted eyes following her down the corridor, stern Ashworth men in high collars, a few stiff-backed Ashworth wives. And then, near the end of the hall, a gap. A rectangle of slightly less faded wallpaper where a painting had clearly hung for decades and had clearly, recently, been removed. She didn't think much of it that night. She would think about it constantly later. She found her grandmother's bedroom on the second floor, preserved like a museum exhibit, a vanity table with a trifold mirror, drawers full of yellowed letters, and on the nightstand, a single black and white photograph in a silver frame, two young women, arms linked, laughing at something outside the frame, standing in front of this very house when it was new and unweathered and full of light. Claire recognized one of the women, barely, as her grandmother, younger than Claire had ever seen her, maybe 19 or 20. She did not recognize the other woman at all. But something about the stranger's smile made the hair on Claire's arm stand up, the particular wrongness of a smile aimed at someone just out of frame, like she was laughing at a joke only she and the photographer understood. On the back of the photograph, in faded pencil, someone had written a single line. E and V, before everything. Claire set the photograph down and did not sleep well that night. She kept hearing the house settle, old wood groaning the way old wood does, except every so often, the groans sounded less like wood and more like something dragging itself, slowly, through a space that wasn't supposed to exist. 3 days into cataloging the house for the estate lawyer, Claire found the library, and in the library, the bookshelf that did not sit flush against the wall the way every other bookshelf in the house did. It was a small thing. A half-inch gap at the base, dust scattered in a fan pattern on the floor in front of it, like it had been moved recently and moved often. Claire, who had spent a career noticing the kind of details most people walked past, noticed it immediately. She pulled the shelf, and it rolled, smoothly, silently, on a track someone had oiled far more recently than 60 years ago, to reveal a narrow oak door, bolted from this side with 3 heavy iron locks that looked original to the house's construction in 1911. Her grandmother had a sense of humor, apparently, because all 3 locks were unlocked. As though Vivian had wanted whoever came after her to find this. As though she'd been waiting, for years, for someone to finally open the door she herself could never bring herself to walk through again. This is the moment Claire would later describe, to anyone who asked, as the moment the house stopped being a house and started being a question. She pushed the door open onto a narrow staircase descending into total darkness, the air rolling out to meet her thick with dust and that same sweet, waxy, wrong smell from the hook of our story, old cosmetics, old paper, and something else underneath it that she didn't yet have a word for, but that her body recognized before her mind did. The smell of a room that had been sealed around its own silence for a very, very long time. She should have called someone. She would tell you that herself, looking back. She should have called Walter, or the lawyer, or honestly the police. Instead, she did what we all secretly know we would do, flashlight gripped tight, heart hammering, curiosity stronger than fear, she went down the stairs. 12 steps. She counted them without meaning to. At the bottom, a single room, maybe 15 feet square, windowless, the walls painted a soft rose gold that had not been fashionable since the Kennedy administration. And in the center of the room, untouched by 6 decades of dust somehow, a vanity table. A genuine 1960s vanity, trifold mirror, ivory-handled brushes laid out in a neat row like their owner had just stepped away for a moment and fully intended to come back. Claire's professional eye catalogued it instantly, a powder compact, gold-plated, the kind sold only through department store counters before 1965. A bottle of perfume, evaporated down to a dried amber residue. And a lipstick, open, the bullet worn down at an angle from years of use, the color oxidized to a deep rust brown that Claire, with her trained eye, recognized immediately as a shade that had once been a vivid, theatrical red. She picked it up. On the bottom of the gold tube, in tiny embossed script, a name, Crimson Hour, Maison Rêve, number 7. It was a discontinued shade. Claire knew this because she'd catalogued one exactly like it for a museum exhibit 2 years prior, a shade so famously vivid it had been nicknamed the actress's red because every aspiring starlet in 1962 supposedly wore it to auditions, believing it brought luck. And scrawled across the vanity mirror, in that same dried rust red, in handwriting that was not her grandmother's careful cursive but something jagged, urgent, pressed hard enough to crack the glass beneath it, were 5 words that made Claire's blood run cold. She knows what he did. Claire stood frozen in that windowless rose-gold room for what felt like an hour but was probably 90 seconds, staring at words written in lipstick by a hand that had clearly been shaking, asking herself the only question that mattered. Who is she? Who is he? And what, exactly, did he do? She would not get even a partial answer for another 9 days. But that night, driving back into town for groceries because the Manor's kitchen held nothing but expired canned goods, Claire would catch her own reflection in the rearview mirror at a stoplight and swear, that for half a second, the reflection's mouth was not smiling the way hers was. The Marrow Hollow Diner had not changed its menu, its booths, or apparently its clientele since approximately 1987. Claire sat at the counter the next morning, nursing a coffee, and made the mistake, or the very deliberate choice, depending on how you look at it, of asking the waitress, a sturdy woman in her 60s named Dot, if she remembered the Ashworth family. Dot's hand stopped mid-pour. Everybody in this town remembers the Ashworths, Dot said carefully, setting the pot down. Question is whether anybody'll talk about them. Why wouldn't they? Dot glanced toward the booth in the corner, where 2 old men were playing cards and very deliberately not looking up, and lowered her voice. There was a girl. Eleanor. Married into the family back in '62. Pretty as anything, they say she could have been in pictures, real Hollywood pictures, before old Augustus Ashworth scooped her up. Then one night in October, she just wasn't there anymore. No body. No note. No nothing. Sheriff at the time called it a runaway bride. Town called it whatever made everybody sleep easier. And what do you call it? Claire asked. Dot's eyes flicked toward the window, toward the dark tree lean beyond which the Manor sat invisible but felt, the way a held breath is felt in a quiet room. I call it the reason nobody in this town goes up to that house after dark, miss, and I'd think real hard before you start digging at something that's been buried 62 years for a reason. It was at this exact moment that the diner door opened, and a woman in her 40s walked in, sharp-eyed, notebook visible in her bag, the unmistakable energy of someone whose entire personality had been shaped by a job that required relentless curiosity. She introduced herself as Nora Calloway, features editor and sole remaining staff writer for the Marrow Hollow Sentinel, and she sat down next to Claire without being invited, which Claire would later learn was simply how Nora operated. "You're the granddaughter," Nora said. It wasn't a question. "How did you know that?" "Small town. And because I've been trying to get into that house for 6 years, and you just inherited the keys." Nora's smile was sharp, but not unkind. "I've been writing about Eleanor Ashworth since I was 26 years old. Cold case nobody wants to call a case. You want to know what really happened up there, you're going to need someone who's already done the homework. I'm offering." Claire should have said no. Strangers offering help on a 60-year-old disappearance is, generally speaking, exactly the kind of thing a sensible person declines. But Claire was thinking about a lipstick worn down at an angle, and 5 words scrawled in rage or terror across a cracked mirror, and she heard herself say, "Okay. Tell me everything you know." What Nora knew, it turned out, was substantial, and almost none of it had ever been printed, because almost none of it could be proven. Eleanor Whitfield had arrived in Marrow Hollow in 1960, a beauty pageant runner-up from Hartford with ambitions of a screen career, and had been swept off her feet within 4 months by Augustus Ashworth, heir to the Ashworth textile fortune, 12 years her senior, charming in the particular way that wealthy men are charming when they've never once in their lives been told no. They married in the spring of 1961. By the fall of 1962, Eleanor Ashworth had vanished from the face of the earth, and Augustus himself had disappeared less than 3 months later, after telling the sheriff he was going to clear his head on a fishing trip up north and simply never returning. His boat was found capsized on Lake Verro 11 days later. No body. Case closed, officially, as an accidental drowning brought on by grief. Convenient, Claire said. Extremely, Nora agreed. And here's the part that nobody's ever explained to my satisfaction. Augustus had a sister, Marjorie. Younger by 6 years, sharp as a blade, ran the business side of the family textile mills practically since she was 22 because Augustus, by all accounts, couldn't be bothered. When both Eleanor and Augustus disappeared inside of a single year, Marjorie inherited everything. The mills. The money. Eventually, decades later, even the manor itself, when she sold it to. Nora paused. To your grandmother, she finished. In 1979. For $1. Claire set her coffee down very slowly. $1, Nora repeated. For a 32-room mansion that, in 1979 money, was worth well over $500,000. You want to tell me that's not the strangest real estate transaction you've ever heard of? It was. It absolutely was. And it raised a question that would not leave Claire alone for the rest of the day. What, exactly, had her grandmother Vivian done, said, or known, that was worth an entire mansion sold to her for the price of a cup of coffee? That night, back at the manor, Claire returned to her grandmother's bedroom with new eyes. If Vivian had bought this house, sight unseen, gutted of its history, for a single dollar, there had to be a reason. People do not give away $500,000 houses out of kindness. They give them away to bury something. She went through the vanity drawers again, more carefully this time, and found, taped to the underside of the bottom drawer, an envelope that had clearly been hidden, not stored. Inside, a stack of letters, postmarked between September and November of 1962, all addressed to Vivian Cole, her grandmother's maiden name, and all from the same sender. Eleanor Ashworth. Claire's hands shook as she unfolded the first one. Asterisk Viv, I don't know who else to tell this. I think Augustus knows about the baby. He's been different this week, cold in a way I've never seen, and Marjorie keeps watching me at dinner like she's waiting for me to say something wrong. I'm scared, Viv. I know that sounds dramatic, but I've never been scared of him before and I am now. If anything happens to me, I want you to know it wasn't an accident, whatever they tell you. Burn this after you read it, asterisk. Claire's grandmother had not burned it. Claire's grandmother had kept it, hidden, for 62 years. The baby. Eleanor had been pregnant. This single fact reframed everything Claire thought she understood about the case, because a missing pregnant bride is not a runaway bride story, it is a motive story, and motive stories have suspects. The second letter, dated 3 weeks later, was shorter, and the handwriting had changed, tighter, smaller, the handwriting of someone trying very hard to appear calm. Asterisk Viv, Marjorie came to see me alone today. She didn't ask about the baby. She asked about the will. I don't understand why she'd ask me about the will unless she already knows something I don't. I keep thinking about leaving, just taking the car and going, but Augustus has the only set of keys and he's started locking them in his desk. I feel like a piece of furniture in this house. I feel like I'm being catalogued, asterisk. The third letter was the last, and it was barely 4 lines, the handwriting nearly illegible. Asterisk if you don't hear from me by Sunday, go to Sheriff Tull. Tell him to look at the east wing, behind the library. Tell him to look at her, not him. I was wrong about who to be afraid of. I love you. Don't let them forget I was here, asterisk. Claire sat on the floor of her grandmother's bedroom for a long time after reading that last letter, the lamp throwing long shadows across the wallpaper, and felt something she had not expected to feel for a woman who had been a stranger to her in life, a fierce, protective grief for Eleanor Ashworth, who had been 23 years old, pregnant, frightened, and almost certainly murdered in this house, and for whom, as far as Claire could tell, absolutely nothing had ever been done. Tell him to look at her, not him. Eleanor had been afraid of Augustus. And then, in her final days, she had become more afraid of Marjorie. And somewhere in this house, 62 years ago, Eleanor Ashworth had been silenced before she could finish explaining why. The next morning, Claire found Walter Greer exactly where she expected to find him, kneeling in the overgrown rose garden behind the east wing, pruning shears in hand, working with the unhurried precision of a man who had performed this exact task 10,000 times. "You knew her," Claire said, no preamble. "Eleanor. You worked here in 1962. Walter's shears stopped moving. He did not look up. "I was 19, he said finally. "Hired on as a stable hand at Spring. I'd carry her parcels up from town sometimes when the chauffeur was busy. She was kind to me. Most of that family wasn't kind to anybody who worked for wages, but she was." "What happened to her, Walter?" "I don't know." He said it too fast, and they both heard it. "Walter." He set down the shears and finally looked at her, and Claire saw something in his face she hadn't expected, not guilt, exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a man who has carried a weight so long he's forgotten what his back felt like without it. "There was a night," he said slowly, "in late October. I was meant to be off the property by 6, but I'd left a ladder up against the east wing and come back for it after dark. I saw lights on in the library, late, past midnight, which wasn't usual. And I heard," he stopped. "You heard what?" "Arguing." A woman's voice, raised, and then it just stopped. Cut off mid-word. "And about 10 minutes later I saw Mr. Ashworth come out the side door carrying something wrapped in a bedsheet, heavy enough that he was struggling with it, and he put it in the trunk of his car and drove off toward the lake road. I never told anyone. I was 19 and scared, and my whole livelihood depended on that family, and by the time I worked up the nerve to say something, Eleanor had already been reported missing for 2 days and everybody had already decided she'd run off with some fella from Hartford. Telling the truth at that point felt like it wouldn't bring her back. It would just get me fired, or worse. Or worse." Walter's eyes drifted, unwillingly, toward the dark windows of the east wing. Augustus Ashworth was not a man you crossed, Miss Donnelly. And neither, in her own way, was his sister. "Did you ever tell my grandmother any of this?" Something flickered across Walter's face, quick, complicated, gone before Claire could fully read it. "Your grandmother," he said carefully, "knew more about that night than I ever did. I just heard an argument through a window. Vivian was in that house." The wind picked up across the rose garden, scattering dead petals across the overgrown path, and Claire felt the same cold thread of dread she'd felt at the crack in the library wall, the certainty that the ground beneath this entire investigation was not solid, that with every step she was discovering not new facts but new depths, each one darker than the last. Her grandmother had been in the house the night Eleanor disappeared. Her grandmother had then bought that same house, decades later, for $1. And her grandmother had spent the rest of her life never once speaking of any of it, until she died, and left the whole rotten secret to a granddaughter she'd barely known, as though some part of her had finally, at the very end, needed someone to find what she could never bring herself to dig up herself. That afternoon, Nora arrived at the manor with a box of old newspaper archives and a theory she'd been chasing for years, and the two women spread everything across the dining room table, the largest flat surface in the house not currently buried under sheets. "Here," Nora said, sliding over a yellowed front page from the Sentinel, dated November 1962. "Local heiress presumed missing, family requests privacy." Beneath the headline, a photograph of Eleanor Ashworth at what appeared to be a charity gala, radiant, dark-haired, wearing a dress that even in faded black and white practically shimmered, that famous actress's red lipstick unmistakable even in grainy newsprint. Standing just behind her shoulder, slightly out of focus but unmistakable, a woman in a severe tailored suit watching Eleanor with an expression Claire could only describe as hunger. "That's Marjorie," Nora said. "And look at the date on this gala. 3 weeks before Eleanor disappeared." Claire studied the photograph for a long moment, and then something nagged at her, the photograph she'd found her first night in the house, the silver-framed picture of her grandmother and a stranger, before everything. She retrieved it from the bedroom and laid it next to the newspaper clipping. The stranger in her grandmother's photograph and Eleanor Ashworth in the newspaper were the same woman. Vivian Cole and Eleanor Ashworth had not been distant acquaintances in a small town. They had been close. Close enough to be photographed laughing together, arms linked, in front of a mansion neither of them yet owned. Close enough that Eleanor, in her final desperate letter, had written "I love you" to a friend she trusted with her life. "Your grandmother wasn't just a witness," Nora said slowly, putting words to the thought forming in both their minds at once. She was Eleanor's best friend. Maybe her only real confidant in that entire house. And she never said a single word about any of it for 62 years. Why would she stay silent that long? Claire asked. If she loved her, if she knew what happened, why bury it? Nora's expression turned grim. Because whoever did it made sure she understood what would happen if she didn't. It was at that exact moment, as if summoned by the conversation itself, that something thudded against the dining room window, not hard, not violent, but deliberate, the unmistakable sound of a small object striking glass on purpose. Both women froze. Claire crossed to the window and looked out into the darkening garden, where nothing moved except the wind in the dead roses. On the porch step, when she finally worked up the nerve to open the front door, she found a single object waiting, placed with obvious care directly in the center of the mat. A lipstick. Gold tube. Worn down at an angle. Crimson hour. Identical to the one in the secret room. Except this one was new, the wax inside still vivid, still that impossible theatrical red, no oxidation at all, no 62 years of decay. Someone, somewhere, still had access to a discontinued cosmetic from 1962. And someone wanted Claire to know they were watching. Sleep, that night, did not come easily, and when it finally did, it came with the kind of dream that feels less like imagination and more like memory borrowing a stranger's body. Claire dreamed she was standing on the shore of Lake Vermont in 1962, watching a car's headlights disappear down a dirt road, the cold October air thick with the smell of wet pine and something else underneath it, that same waxy sweetness, the smell of the secret room, the smell of crimson hour drying into rust. She woke at 4 in the morning to the absolute certainty that she needed to see the lake. Nora, when called at an hour no reasonable person answers their phone, agreed to meet her there anyway, muttering something about journalists keeping vampire hours by necessity. Lake Vermont in the gray pre-dawn light was smaller than Claire expected, more pond than lake, ringed by black pine, the kind of water that swallows light instead of reflecting it. A faded plaque near the boat launch, installed sometime in the 1970s and never updated, commemorated nothing in particular except the town's general fondness for fishing tournaments. "This is where they found Augustus's boat," Nora said, pulling her coat tighter against the cold. "Capsized, no body, case closed as an accidental drowning. Convenient, the way everything in this story is convenient." "You don't think he drowned?" "I think," Nora said carefully, "that a man who may have just killed his pregnant wife had every reason in the world to disappear and let everyone assume he was dead. And I think a town that desperately wanted this story to end had every reason in the world to let him." Claire walked the shoreline slowly, scanning the tree line, and stopped at an old boathouse half collapsed into the water, its door hanging off one rusted hinge. Inside, beneath decades of leaves and rot, she found something that made her stomach drop, a child's rocking horse, weathered but intact, the kind of object that had absolutely no reason to be stored in an abandoned boathouse unless someone had needed somewhere private to put something they couldn't bear to look at but couldn't bring themselves to destroy. Carved into the underside of the rocking horse, in handwriting Claire now recognized immediately from the secret room mirror, that same jagged, frightened script, were 2 words. "Forgive me." This was meant for the baby, Claire whispered. Eleanor's baby. She was already preparing things, hiding them, like she knew she might not be around to give them herself. Nora knelt beside her, quiet for once, and the 2 women sat with the weight of that realization in the cold morning air, a woman, 23 years old, pregnant and terrified in her own home, already saying goodbye to a child she somehow understood she might never get to raise. It was Nora who spotted the second carving, lower on the underside of the rocking horse, scratched in more recently, the wood lighter there, less weathered, the cut marks sharper. A date. 6 months ago. Someone had been to this boathouse recently. Someone had found this rocking horse, read the message meant for a baby that never grew up, and added something of their own. Claire turned the horse fully into the weak morning light to read it. She's still watching. Tell no one, asterisk asterisk. By mid-morning, fortified by diner coffee and a shared, unspoken agreement to be more careful from this point forward, Claire and Nora drove to the one remaining piece of the Ashworth story that wasn't buried in a lake or a basement. Marjorie Ashworth Pratt, now 89 years old, living in a sprawling lakeside estate on the good side of Marrow Hollow, where she had spent the last 4 decades as the town's most generous philanthropist, funding the library, the hospital wing, the high school's entire arts program. She gives this town more money in a year than most people see in a lifetime, Nora said as they pulled into the long gravel drive. Funds a scholarship in Eleanor's name, even. Calls her, my dear departed sister-in-law, in every speech. Nobody in this town would hear a word against her. That's either genuine grief, Claire said, or the longest con I've ever heard of. Marjorie received them in a sunroom overlooking the lake, a tiny woman with sharp blue eyes and silver hair pinned with old-fashioned precision, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body had become a slower vehicle for a mind that had never slowed down at all. She did not seem surprised to see them. She seemed, if anything, like she had been expecting this visit for 62 years. You're Vivian's granddaughter, Marjorie said, before introductions were even finished. You have her eyes. She had Eleanor's eyes too, in a manner of speaking, both of them always looking at me like they expected me to be the villain of the story. Were you? Claire asked, deciding directness was the only currency that might work on a woman this composed. Marjorie's smile did not waver. Eleanor was a sweet girl who married above her station and was utterly unprepared for what that family actually was. My brother was charming and weak and cruel in the particular way only weak men manage to be cruel. He needed people to need him, and when Eleanor stopped needing him, when she started talking about leaving, about taking the baby and going back to her family in Hartford, he could not abide it. Augustus killed her. I have believed that with my whole heart for 62 years, and I have spent every year since trying to build something good out of the wreckage he left behind. It was a smooth answer. Too smooth, perhaps, the kind of answer that has been polished by decades of repetition until all the rough, true edges have worn away. Then why, Nora asked, did Eleanor's last letter to Vivian say to look at you, not him? For the first time, something shifted behind Marjorie's eyes, brief, controlled, gone almost instantly, but Claire saw it, and so did Nora. I don't know what letter you're referring to, Marjorie said, and I think it's time you both left my home. One more question, Claire said, standing, refusing to be rushed. Why did you sell my grandmother this entire mansion for $1? Marjorie's hands, folded neatly in her lap, tightened almost imperceptibly. Because Vivian Cole, Marjorie said, very quietly, knew exactly what she was buying. And exactly what she was agreeing to keep buried with it. Ask yourself, Miss Donnelly, why a woman would spend the rest of her life living inside the very house where her best friend disappeared. Some people stay close to their grief because they cannot let go of it. And some people stay close to it because someone is making absolutely certain they never leave. It was the closest thing to a confession either woman would get that day, and it sent Claire and Nora back down the gravel drive in tense silence, the lake glittering cold and indifferent behind them, the unmistakable sense settling over both of them that they had just been threatened with extraordinary politeness by a woman who had spent 6 decades learning exactly how to make threats sound like wisdom. That night, unable to shake the conversation with Marjorie, Claire returned to the secret room beneath the library with fresh eyes and a much sharper sense that she had missed something on her first visit. She measured the room, 15 feet by 15 feet, she'd assumed, eyeballing it the first time. But standing in the corner now with a tape measure borrowed from Walter's shed, the math didn't add up. The room was 15 feet wide but only 11 feet deep. 4 feet of space, somewhere, unaccounted for. She found the seam in the rose-gold wallpaper behind the vanity, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it, a vertical line where the pattern didn't quite align. She pressed against it, and a narrow panel swung inward on a hidden hinge, revealing a second chamber, smaller, darker, windowless within a windowless room, a secret folded inside a secret like the worst kind of nesting doll. Inside, a child's crib, untouched, blanket still folded at the foot exactly as someone had left it 62 years ago. And against the far wall, a steamer trunk, its leather straps brittle with age, secured with a padlock that crumbled to rust the moment Claire touched it. Inside the trunk, dozens of cosmetic items, all maison rêve, all from the same 1962 collection, but also documents. A marriage certificate. A birth certificate, never filed, for a baby girl, name left blank, born and died on the same October night in 1962, cause of death left chillingly empty. And beneath that, a single sealed envelope addressed, in Vivian's unmistakable handwriting, to whoever finds this room. Claire's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a letter dated only 6 months prior, written, impossibly, in the final months of her grandmother's life. Asterisk, if you are reading this, I am dead, and you are likely my granddaughter, because I have made certain this house goes to no one else. I am so sorry, Claire. I am sorry for the silence, and I am sorry that silence is the only inheritance I had left to give you, wrapped, as it always is, inside everything else, asterisk. Asterisk, Eleanor Ashworth was my best friend and the bravest person I have ever known. She did not run away. She was murdered in this house on the night of October 19, 1962, and her child died alongside her, and I have spent 62 years protecting the people responsible because I was made to understand, in the clearest possible terms, what would happen to me and to my family if I ever told the truth, asterisk. Asterisk, I am dying now of something the doctors cannot quite name, and I find that a dying woman runs out of room for fear. I could not bring myself to say this aloud while I was alive. Too many people are still watching, Claire, more than you understand, and some of them are far closer than you think. But I could not let it die with me either, asterisk. Asterisk, Eleanor did not fear Augustus by the end. She told me, in the very last conversation we ever had, just hours before she disappeared, it isn't him I'm afraid of anymore, Viv. It's her. He's weak. She's the one who's dangerous. Promise me, if anything happens, you'll remember that it was her. Asterisk. Asterisk, I have kept that promise exactly as well as a frightened 20-year-old girl could keep it. I am sorry it has taken me 62 years and my own death to finish keeping it properly. Find the truth, Claire. Finish what I could not. And please, be careful. The person who silenced Eleanor is still alive, and she has had 62 years to perfect the art of never being suspected of anything at all, asterisk. Claire sat on the cold floor of the second hidden room, the crib in the corner, the letter shaking in her hands, and understood, with absolute clarity, that her grandmother had just handed her, from beyond the grave, a murder investigation that had been deliberately, expertly buried for over 6 decades, and a single name, unwritten but unmistakable, pointing directly at the silver-haired philanthropist who funded the library, the hospital, and a scholarship named after the very woman she'd had a hand in killing. The next morning brought a new lead, almost accidental in how it arrived. Nora, digging through old hospital donor records for a separate piece on Marjorie's philanthropy, called Claire sounding strange, distracted, unsettled in a way Claire hadn't heard from her before. There's a doctor here in town, Nora said. Edmund Marsh. Runs the family practice on Elm Street, has for almost 40 years, beloved by everyone, delivered half this town's children including, apparently, me. I've interviewed him a dozen times for puff pieces about the hospital wing. But I just pulled his original medical board registration from 1981, because something's been bugging me, and the registration lists his place of birth as Hartford, Connecticut, his date of birth as June, 1928. Okay, Claire said slowly. Claire, Augustus Ashworth was born in June of 1928. In Hartford. The silence on the line stretched long enough that Claire could hear her own pulse. That doesn't mean anything, Claire said, even as every instinct in her body told her it absolutely did. Lots of men were born in 1928. In Hartford, sharing the exact month, with a medical license that materializes out of nowhere 4 years after he supposedly drowned in Lake Vero, with 0 prior medical training on record anywhere before that registration. Nora's voice had gone tight with the particular excitement of a journalist watching a 6-year hunch finally bear fruit. Claire, I think Augustus Ashworth never drowned at all. I think he faked his death, disappeared for 4 years, came back with a new face. Plastic surgery was already advanced enough by the late 60s for a wealthy man to disappear into a new identity if he had the money and the patience, and has been living in this town for the last 45 years as the town doctor everyone trusts with their children. Claire thought of the rocking horse in the boathouse, the recent carving, she's still watching, tell no one. She thought of a town doctor with intimate, decades-long access to every family in Marrow Hollow, including, she now realized with a fresh chill, her own grandmother, who had lived alone in a remote mansion and died of something the doctors couldn't quite name. Nora, Claire said slowly, who was my grandmother's physician. The pause on the other end of the line told Claire the answer before Nora said it out loud. Dr. Edmund Marsh, Nora said. He signed her death certificate himself. They went together, because by this point neither of them was willing to go anywhere in Marrow Hollow alone, and they found Dr. Edmund Marsh exactly where the town directory said he'd be, a tidy brick office on Elm Street, waiting room full of magazines from 3 years ago, a receptionist who waved them through without an appointment because, as she cheerfully explained, Dr. Marsh always makes time for Vivian's family. He was a tall man, even at what would have to be 96 years old if Nora's theory held, though he looked, disconcertingly, perhaps 75, his face smoothed in a way that didn't quite match the liver spots on the backs of his hands, the kind of subtle wrongness Claire's eye, trained to spot the small inconsistencies of restoration and forgery, picked up immediately and couldn't quite name until she was looking directly into his pale gray eyes and the resemblance to the stern Ashworth men in the Manor's hallway portraits hit her like a physical blow. Claire Donnelly, he said warmly, rising from his desk. Vivian's granddaughter. You look like her, you know. Around the eyes. You delivered half this town, Claire said. How long have you practiced here, doctor? Going on 45 years now, he said, with the easy comfort of a story told 1,000 times. Came up from Connecticut as a young man, fresh out of medical training, looking for a quiet town to settle. What's your date of birth, doctor? Something in the room's temperature seemed to drop. Edmund Marsh's smile did not falter, but something behind his eyes went very still, very careful, the look of a man recalculating in real time. That's an unusual question for a house call, he said. You're not Edmund Marsh, Claire said, the words leaving her before she'd fully decided to say them, propelled by certainty rather than caution. You're Augustus Ashworth. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Claire genuinely believed, for one terrifying moment, that they had badly misjudged the safety of this confrontation. And then the tall old man's shoulders sagged, all at once, decades of careful posture collapsing like a structure finally giving way, and when he spoke again his voice had changed entirely, older, rougher, stripped of its practiced doctor's warmth. I didn't kill her, he said. Whatever you think you know, whatever that house has shown you, I did not kill Eleanor. I loved her. God help me, I loved her more than I have ever loved anything in this miserable, borrowed life, and I have spent 62 years paying for a crime I did not commit, because the one person who could clear my name was the same person who made absolutely certain I would never be believed if I tried. Then tell us what happened, Nora said. Tell us the truth, right now, before another single day goes by. Augustus Ashworth, because that is who he was, finally, after 62 years of being someone else, sat back down heavily in his chair, an old man's weight finally settling into an old man's body, and began, at last, to speak. Eleanor told me about the baby in September, Augustus said, staring at a point somewhere past both women, somewhere 62 years in the past. I was happy. I want you to understand that, whatever else you believe about me, I was happy. I know what kind of man people think I was, and they're not entirely wrong. I was weak and selfish, and I let my sister run the family business because it was easier than admitting I had no head for it myself. But I was not a man who wanted to harm his wife and unborn child. Marjorie believed differently, Claire said. Marjorie, Augustus said, and something bitter crossed his face, had spent her entire life building the Ashworth Mills into something extraordinary while I collected the credit and the comfort, and she watched Eleanor, a girl with no business sense, no family money, no claim to anything except my affection, arrive and threaten to inherit half of everything Marjorie had actually built, the moment that baby was born. Eleanor told me, weeks before she died, that Marjorie had started asking pointed questions about the will. About what would happen to controlling interest in the mills if I died with an heir versus without one. I told Eleanor she was imagining things. I told her my sister would never. I was wrong about so many things in my life, but I have never been more catastrophically wrong than I was about that. What happened on the 19th? Nora asked. I came home late from the mill office and found the library in chaos, overturned chair, broken glass, and Marjorie standing very calmly in the middle of it, telling me Eleanor had attacked her in a jealous rage over some imagined slight and fled into the night. I believed her. God forgive me, I believed her completely, because it had never once in my life occurred to me that my own sister could lie to my face with a body cooling somewhere in that house. I spent that entire night searching the grounds, frantic, calling Eleanor's name into the dark, while Marjorie stood on the porch telling me to come inside before I caught a chill. His voice cracked, finally, 62 years of grief breaking through the surface all at once. It was Walter who found me 3 days later, half out of my mind, and told me he'd seen me, carrying something wrapped in a sheet to my own car the night Eleanor disappeared. I told him he was mistaken. I knew, in that moment, with absolute clarity, that Marjorie had dressed in my coat in the dark, taken my car, and made certain a witness would see a tall figure that anyone, in poor light, in a panic, would assume was me. She had built her alibi out of my own silhouette. And I understood, finally, completely, that if I went to the sheriff with my suspicions, I would be the one standing trial, because every circumstantial thread led directly back to my own hands. So you ran, Claire said. I ran, Augustus confirmed, like the coward I have spent 62 years being. I faked the drowning with help from a business associate who owed me a debt large enough to ensure his silence. I disappeared for 4 years while a surgeon in Montreal rebuilt my face for an amount of money that would make your eyes water, and I came back to the one place I never should have returned to, because I could not stay away from the town where she died, and because some twisted, masochistic part of me needed to watch my sister live the rest of her life as a beloved philanthropist, while I lived mine as a man erased. You let an entire town believe you were dead, Nora said, while your sister got away with murder. Yes, Augustus said simply, no defense offered, none available. I have lived a coward's life and I will die a coward's death, and the only thing I have ever done right in 62 years is keep my distance and let this town's quiet life continue undisturbed by a truth none of us were strong enough to survive. There's something you're still not telling us, Claire said, watching his face with the same trained attention she gave to a cracked compact, looking for the seam, the place where the surface didn't quite match what lay beneath. My grandmother knew exactly what happened that night. She wrote it down. She left it for me. And in the last letter Eleanor ever wrote her, Eleanor said it wasn't you she was afraid of by the end. It was Marjorie. Which means Marjorie threatened her before that night. Which means this wasn't a sudden act of rage in an overturned library, doctor. This was planned. For the first time since they'd walked into his office, Augustus Ashworth looked genuinely afraid. There's a great deal you don't understand about my sister, he said quietly. And I would urge you, with everything I have left in this life, to stop digging before she decides you understand too much. That phrase, stop digging before she decides you understand too much, followed Claire home like a shadow with weight, and it was still echoing in her mind 2 days later when she finally found the piece of evidence that would crack the entire case wide open, hiding in the single place she had not yet thought to look, her grandmother's tax records, boxed neatly in the manor's basement, decades of careful, almost compulsive paperwork that painted the picture of a woman who documented everything because some part of her, even in silence, refused to let the truth disappear entirely. Tucked into a 1979 folder, alongside the deed for the $1 purchase of Ashworth Manor, Claire found a separate, smaller receipt, handwritten, on Ashworth Mill's letterhead, signed by Marjorie herself. It was a payment record. Quarterly. Beginning in November of 1962 and continuing, without a single interruption, for the next 17 years, until the year the manor itself was transferred. Payment for continued discretion and silence regarding family matters, it read, in Marjorie's own careful hand, followed by a sum that, even in 1962 dollars, was substantial, and then, after that, a second column listing dates extending across nearly 2 decades. Marjorie had been paying Vivian. Not once. Not as a one-time bribe to leave town and never return. Continuously, methodically, for 17 straight years, as though managing a long-term liability on a balance sheet, until, finally, in 1979, she had simply transferred the entire mansion itself as a final, permanent settlement, severing the financial relationship by handing over an asset instead of cash. Perhaps because by then Marjorie's own fortune had grown large enough that quarterly hush payments had become beneath her, or perhaps because giving Vivian the house itself was its own kind of message. Live inside the place where it happened, every single day, for the rest of your life, as the price of your silence. It was, Claire realized with a sick lurch, not generosity at all. It was the cruelest possible cage, dressed up as a gift. She photographed every page and sent them to Nora with a single line, *, we have her. Financial proof of an ongoing payoff spanning 17 years. This isn't circumstantial anymore, *. Nora's reply came back within a minute, *, don't go to the sheriff alone. Don't go anywhere alone. I'm coming to you right now, *. But Nora did not arrive within the hour, as promised. She did not answer her phone when Claire called 40 minutes later, increasingly anxious, watching the long dirt road for headlights that did not come. And when Claire finally drove into town herself, heart pounding, she found Nora's car still parked outside the Sentinel office, driver's door hanging open, Nora's phone lying shattered on the pavement beside it, and no sign of Nora Calloway anywhere at all. The Sentinel office, when Claire finally worked up the nerve to push through its unlocked front door, told its own story in scattered detail: an overturned chair, a coffee mug shattered against the baseboard, a single drawer of Nora's desk pulled open and rifled through. The specific drawer, Claire would later realize, where Nora had kept 6 years of accumulated research on the Ashworth case. Someone had not simply taken Nora. Someone had taken Nora and every physical scrap of evidence she'd personally gathered, which meant whoever had done this had known exactly what they were looking for and exactly where Nora would have kept it. Claire called the sheriff's department, hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone steady, and was met with the particular brand of small-town skepticism reserved for outsiders making big claims. Sheriff Boyd, a heavy-set man in his 50s who'd clearly inherited both his job and his weary indifference from a long line of Marrow Hollow lawmen, took her statement with visible reluctance and a tone that suggested he'd already decided, before she finished a single sentence, that this was a dramatic misunderstanding rather than an abduction. Folks go missing for an hour in panic, he said. Nora's a grown woman. She probably just stepped out. Her phone is shattered on the pavement, Sheriff. Phones break. Her car door is open. Her research is gone. Sheriff Boyd's expression flickered, briefly, with something that might have been genuine consideration, and then closed again, just as quickly, the way a door closes when someone on the other side has decided, long before this conversation began, exactly how far they're willing to let it go. "I'll have a deputy drive by her place," he said, in a tone that made clear this was the absolute ceiling of his concern, and Claire understood, with a fresh chill, that this was precisely how an entire town had managed to forget a murdered bride for 62 years, not through some grand, coordinated conspiracy, but through exactly this: 100 small, weary refusals to look too closely at something inconvenient, repeated patiently across generations until looking away simply became the town's permanent posture. She would get no help from Marrow Hollow's official channels. If Nora was going to be found, Claire understood with growing dread, she was going to have to be the one to find her, and she was going to have to do it without making the one mistake that had cost Eleanor Ashworth everything 62 years earlier. She was not going to go anywhere near Marjorie Pratt without absolute certainty, and she was not, under any circumstances, going to go there alone. Except, of course, that is precisely what the story demands next. And precisely what Claire, against every shred of good sense, was about to do anyway. Before she did anything else, though, Claire returned one final time to Augustus, Dr. Marsh, whatever name fit the moment, because he was the one remaining person who had survived 62 years inside this story's gravity and might know something neither she nor Nora had yet uncovered. She found his office locked, lights off, a hand-lettered sign taped inside the glass, closed for personal reasons, but the door at the side of the building, leading to the small apartment above the practice where he apparently lived, stood open a careless few inches, and Claire, past the point of caution now, fear for Nora outweighing every instinct toward self-preservation, pushed inside. She found Augustus Ashworth sitting in the dark, an old revolver on the table in front of him that he had clearly been staring at for some time without quite deciding what to do with it. "She's taken your friend," he said, without looking up, before Claire had even spoken. "I had a call an hour ago." A voice I haven't heard directly in over 40 years, though I would know it anywhere, telling me that if I say one more word about that house, about that night, about any of it, to anyone, ever again, your reporter friend disappears the same way Eleanor did. Then help me, Claire said. Right now. Whatever you know that you haven't told us yet. Augustus's hand drifted, briefly, toward the revolver, and Claire's stomach dropped with a fresh kind of fear, but he only pushed it aside, toward the far edge of the table, as though physically removing the temptation from easy reach. There is one thing, he said slowly, that I have never told anyone, in 62 years, because I did not believe anyone would survive knowing it. Marjorie did not act alone that night. She couldn't have. Eleanor was a healthy young woman, frightened but far from helpless, and Marjorie, even at her strongest, was not physically capable of overpowering her by herself. Who helped her? She had a son, Augustus said. Born out of wedlock in 1958, 4 years before Eleanor died, a scandal Marjorie buried so thoroughly that even I, her own brother, only learned of it decades later by accident. She sent the boy away to be raised quietly by a cousin in Burlington, visited him under careful cover, and brought him back to Marrow Hollow only once he was old enough to be useful and discreet about why. His name is Tobias. Tobias Pratt. He took the surname of the cousin's family that raised him, and as far as this town has ever known, he simply arrived in the late 70s as Marjorie's newly discovered nephew, come home to help manage the family's charitable foundation. Claire felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. He's still alive. He runs Marjorie's foundation to this day, Augustus said. Late 60s now himself. Quiet. Efficient. The kind of man nobody looks at twice, which I have always suspected is precisely the point. If my sister has done something to your friend, Miss Donnelly, I promise you, with absolute certainty, that her own hands are clean. Tobias's hands have never been. The Marjorie Ashworth Pratt Charitable Foundation occupied a converted carriage house behind the lakeside estate, tasteful and understated, the kind of building designed to suggest quiet competence rather than draw attention to itself. Claire arrived as dusk settled over Marrow Hollow, every instinct screaming that she should be calling for backup that did not exist in any meaningful form in this town, and let herself in through an unlocked side door because the front had been locked, and something about the asymmetry, one door secured, one carelessly open, felt less like an oversight and more like an invitation. She found Tobias Pratt in the Foundation's back office, exactly as Augustus had described him, unremarkable, gray-suited, the sort of face that slips out of memory the moment you look away from it. He was sitting calmly behind a desk, Nora's 6 years of research spread out neatly in front of him like he'd been enjoying a leisurely read, and on the floor in the corner, bound to a chair but unmistakably alive, eyes wide with fury rather than fear, was Nora Calloway herself. You shouldn't have come alone, Tobias said pleasantly, not rising. Though I suppose, given everything I've read in here tonight, I shouldn't be surprised. The women in your family have a long history of walking into rooms they have no business walking into. Let her go, Claire said, and I won't say a word about any of this. I'll take everything I know and bury it the same way everyone else in this town has, for 62 years. That's a generous offer, Tobias said, but I'm afraid we're rather past the point where I can take your word for anything, Miss Donnelly. Your grandmother gave my mother her word too, you understand. For 17 years she took her payments and kept silent like a good, sensible woman. And then, the moment she died, she handed her granddaughter a treasure map straight to the truth, which tells me that the women in your family, whatever they say in the moment, do not actually keep their promises in the end. He rose, finally, and Claire saw, beneath the gray suit and the forgettable face, something cold and patient settle into his posture, the particular stillness of a man who had spent his entire life being underestimated and had learned, somewhere along the way, to use that invisibility as a weapon. My mother built an entire life out of one desperate night, Tobias said. She was 28 years old, watching her brother throw away everything she had built with her own hands to hand it over to a Hartford beauty queen who couldn't tell a balance sheet from a bedsheet, carrying a child who would inherit half of everything the moment it was born. She did what she had to do to protect what she'd earned. And I have spent my entire life making absolutely certain nobody ever made her pay for it. I am not about to stop now, on the strength of a 62-year-old lipstick stain and a dead woman's guilty conscience. You're the one who's been sending me lipstick, Claire said slowly, pieces sliding together. You knew I'd find the room. You wanted me to find it. I wanted to know how far you'd go, Tobias said. And I wanted you frightened enough to leave it alone before it came to this. You didn't take the warning, Miss Donnelly. Which means now I have to clean up considerably more than I'd hoped to. What happened next happened quickly, and Claire would only fully reconstruct the sequence of it days later, in the careful, methodical way she catalogued everything, piece by piece, after the adrenaline had finally drained from her body. Tobias moved toward her with the calm efficiency of a man who had clearly planned for this exact contingency, and Claire, with nothing else within reach, swept an arm across the desk, sending Nora's scattered research and a heavy glass paperweight crashing to the floor between them, buying herself 2 seconds, maybe 3, which was exactly enough time to reach Nora's chair and yank the loosened restraint Nora had clearly already been working at for the better part of an hour. Go, Nora gasped, the moment her hands were free. Now, Claire, go. They ran together into the dark, up the side door and across the lakeside lawn, Tobias's footsteps behind them unhurried but relentless, the particular confidence of a man who knew this property far better than they did and was in no rush at all. Claire's only thought, blind animal instinct overriding strategy, was the manor. Her car was parked there, her phone was there, and some deeper, less rational part of her believed, with the same certainty her grandmother must have felt 62 years ago, that the house itself, with all its secrets finally exposed to daylight, might somehow be safer than anywhere else in Marrow Hollow. It was not. It was, in fact, exactly the opposite, because Tobias Pratt had grown up visiting that mansion his entire life under cover of being Marjorie's quiet, dutiful nephew, and he knew its corridors and hidden doors at least as well as Claire did by now, better, in places, because he had been studying them for decades while she had been studying them for weeks. They made it as far as the library before he caught them, calm and unhurried, blocking the doorway with the relaxed confidence of a man who had simply walked, rather than run, the entire way. There's nowhere in this house I don't know, Tobias said. You should have run for town. Amateur mistake. He herded them, with the quiet menace of someone entirely confident in his own control of the situation, toward the bookshelf that Claire herself had discovered weeks earlier, and Claire understood, with a sick lurch of dread, exactly what he intended, to finish, in this generation, what his mother had started in the last, by sealing both witnesses inside the same windowless room that had already swallowed one woman's life and decades of silence along with it. You don't have to do this, Claire said, stalling, searching the dim room for anything, any advantage, any exit Tobias hadn't already anticipated. Your mother is 89 years old. Whatever happens now, she's not going to live long enough to face real consequences for what happened in 1962. You're not protecting her anymore. You're just protecting yourself. Something flickered across Tobias's careful face, the first genuine crack Claire had seen in his composure all night. My mother, he said, voice tightening, gave up everything to raise me from a distance, in secret, so I'd never carry the shame of being born the way I was. She built an empire with her own hands and never once let anyone forget she deserved every inch of it. I have spent 68 years making sure the world saw her exactly the way she wanted to be seen. I am not going to let 2 reckless women undo that in a single night because they couldn't resist poking around an old house. And it was in that exact moment, Tobias's attention fully, finally, locked on Claire, his guard dropped just enough, that Nora, who had spent the last several minutes quietly working her freed hands toward the heavy brass library lamp on the nearest table, swung it with every ounce of strength a furious, terrified journalist could summon, and caught him square across the temple. Tobias went down hard, the lamp shattering against the floorboards beside him, and for one suspended, breathless moment neither Claire nor Nora moved, both staring at the crumpled gray-suited figure as though waiting for him to rise again out of sheer stubborn menace. He did not rise. He was breathing, unconscious but breathing, and Claire, hand shaking so violently she could barely manage it, finally got her phone working long enough to call for help, abandoning all faith in Sheriff Boyd's casual indifference and instead reaching the state police directly, describing an abduction, an assault, 62 years of buried evidence, and watching, with something like disbelief, as the dispatcher's board opening tone shifted rapidly into urgent, focused attention the moment. Claire mentioned Marjorie Pratt's name alongside the words financial records proving an ongoing payoff. What followed, over the next several hours, unfolded with the strange anticlimactic efficiency that real justice so often has, compared to the version we imagine in our heads, state troopers arriving within 40 minutes, Tobias taken into custody still groggy from the lamp's impact, Nora giving her statement wrapped in a trooper's jacket on the manor's front steps with the particular calm of someone who has just survived something and is choosing, deliberately, not to fall apart until later. In private. Marjorie Pratt was arrested the following morning, in her sunroom overlooking the lake, the same room where she had told Claire, with such smooth and practiced calm, that some people stay close to their grief because they cannot let go of it. The financial records, Nora's 6 years of research, Vivian's letters, the carved rocking horse, and finally, the unexpected, devastating testimony of Augustus Ashworth himself, alive, after 62 years, willing at last to speak, combined to form a case that even Sheriff Boyd, to his credit, could no longer wave away. Marjorie never confessed outright. She was, to the very end, exactly the kind of woman who has spent so long curating her own narrative that even facing genuine consequences, she could not quite bring herself to abandon the performance. But under questioning, confronted with the financial trail spanning 17 years, she said one thing that the state's attorney would later describe as close enough to an admission for any jury in the country. Eleanor was always going to take everything I built, Marjorie said, staring past her questioners at some fixed point in the middle distance. I simply made certain she didn't get the chance. It was the closest the town of Marrow Hollow would ever get to a full confession. For most people who had waited 62 years for the truth, it was, in the end, more than enough. Eleanor Ashworth's remains, along with those of the infant daughter she never had the chance to name, were found 3 weeks later, exactly where Augustus's panicked, decades-old account suggested they might be, beneath the floorboards of the old boathouse at Lake Vero, the same boathouse where Claire and Nora had found a rocking horse carved with a message meant for a child who never lived to read it. The discovery made national news for exactly 4 days, the particular brief, intense flare of attention that true crime stories generate before the cycle moves on to the next one. But for Marrow Hollow, the discovery changed something permanent and quiet in the texture of the town itself, the kind of change that doesn't make headlines but reshapes a place from the inside, the way a long-held breath reshapes a chest the moment it's finally released. Claire stood at the edge of the excavation on a cold November morning, exactly 62 years and 23 days after Eleanor disappeared, and watched the careful, respectful work of the state forensic team, and felt something complicated settle in her chest, not quite relief, not quite grief, something closer to the specific ache of watching a story finally reach the ending it had been owed for 6 decades. Far too late to undo any of the damage, but not too late, perhaps, to finally tell the truth out loud. Walter Greer stood beside her, hat in his weathered hands, and said nothing for a long time. I should have told someone, he said finally. All those years ago. I was a coward, same as Augustus. You were 19, Claire said. And scared. And the people who should have protected you instead built an entire system designed to make silence the only safe option. That's not the same thing as cowardice, Walter. That's just what fear does to people who have no power. Walter's eyes, when he finally looked at her, were wet. Your grandmother carried this her whole life. I used to wonder, sometimes, why a woman with money enough to live anywhere chose to spend 60 years in the one house holding the worst thing that ever happened to her. I think I understand it now. I think she couldn't leave Eleanor alone in that room. Even buried, even silenced, she couldn't leave her alone in the dark. In the weeks that followed, while Marjorie Pratt's trial date was set and Tobias awaited his own separate proceedings for the kidnapping of Nora Calloway and his role in his mother's decades-long conspiracy of silence, Claire did the one thing her training, her career, her entire strange and specific skill set had prepared her for better than almost anyone else alive. She restored the vanity. It took her 3 careful weeks, working in the rose-gold room with its door finally, permanently propped open, sunlight from a temporary work lamp replacing the flashlight beam that had once trembled in her hand on the worst night of this entire story. She cleaned the trifold mirror without erasing the crack Eleanor's frightened hand had pressed into the glass 62 years earlier. Some damage, Claire decided, deserved to be preserved rather than fixed, a permanent record of a moment too important to smooth away. She catalogued every cosmetic item with the same careful reverence she gave museum pieces, because in the truest sense, that's exactly what they were, artifacts of a life cut short, evidence of a woman who had loved beautiful things and deserved, more than anything, to be remembered as a person and not merely as a cold case. The lipstick, the original crimson hour, worn down at its tragic angle, she did not restore at all. She placed it, exactly as she'd found it, oxidized rust-brown and silent, inside a small glass case, alongside a printed copy of Eleanor's final letter, in what would eventually become a small, permanent memorial room open to the public, funded not by Marjorie's tainted philanthropy but by an anonymous donation that Claire strongly suspected, though she never confirmed it, came from a guilt-stricken old man who had once been a town's beloved doctor and was now, finally, simply an old man named Augustus Ashworth, living out whatever years he had left under his own true name for the first time in 62 years. Claire stayed in Marrow Hollow longer than she'd ever intended to, first weeks, then months, the manor slowly transforming under her hands from a museum of sealed grief into something that finally, cautiously, resembled a home. She did not sell it. She could not have explained exactly why, except that some part of her understood, now, what her grandmother must have felt all those years ago, that some houses are not simply structures you live inside, but obligations you carry, places that have asked something of you and deserve, in return, to finally be allowed to breathe. Nora, true to her nature, turned the entire story into the defining work of her career, a 6-part investigative series that finally, properly, gave Eleanor Ashworth her name back in print, not as a cold case footnote but as a fully realized woman who had been brave, frightened, in love, and ultimately failed by nearly everyone who should have protected her. The series won awards Nora pretended not to care about and absolutely did. Walter retired from groundskeeping that spring, at the age of 83, finally allowing himself the rest 60 years of guilt had never let him take. Claire visited him every week until he passed, peacefully, 18 months later, and made certain, at his request, that he was buried in the small plot behind the rose garden he'd tended for over 6 decades, close enough, he told her, smiling for what she suspected was the first time in years, that he could keep an eye on the place even from underground. And on quiet evenings, when the house settled into the particular silence that old houses keep, Claire would sometimes sit in the rose-gold room beneath the library, beside the restored vanity and the small glass case holding a 62-year-old lipstick, and she would think about the strange, terrible inheritance her grandmother had left her, not a house, not money, but a debt of truth that had taken 3 generations to finally come due. She thought, often, about the photograph that had started everything, 2 young women, arms linked, laughing in front of a house that had not yet learned to keep secrets. E and V, before everything. She kept that photograph on her own nightstand now, in the same silver frame, in the same room where her grandmother had once slept with a truth too heavy to speak aloud. And every so often, late at night, in the particular quiet that comes just before sleep, Claire would find herself whispering the same 4 words to the dark, half promise and half prayer, the closest thing to closure that a story this old and this broken could ever really offer. I remember you, Eleanor. I remember you. There is one final detail worth telling you, because it is the kind of detail that makes a true story feel less like a closed case file and more like the thing it actually was, a wound that never fully heals, only learns to close around its own scar tissue. Months after the trial concluded, after Marjorie Pratt was sentenced to the maximum the law would allow for a woman of her age and the considerable resources of her legal defense, after Tobias Pratt's own separate conviction quietly closed the final chapter of the Ashworth family's 62-year secret, Claire received, unexpectedly, a small package in the mail with no return address. Inside, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, was a single gold lipstick tube. New, unused, the wax inside still vivid, that impossible theatrical red that had once been called the actress's red, the shade an entire generation of frightened, hopeful young women had worn for luck. There was no note. There didn't need to be one. Claire understood exactly what it meant, and exactly who, somewhere out there, had wanted her to have it, a final, wordless acknowledgement from a man who had spent 62 years as someone else, finally returning, in the only language this story had ever really spoken, to the truth he could never quite bring himself to say out loud, that some things, once buried, do not stay buried forever. That houses remember. That walls, eventually, find a way to breathe. And that somewhere, in a quiet Vermont town that had spent 6 decades learning how to forget, a young woman named Eleanor Ashworth had finally, after 62 long years in the dark, been found. If this story stayed with you, if you felt that particular chill settle in somewhere around the secret room, or the letters, or the lipstick that wasn't supposed to still be vivid after 60 years, that's the feeling we chase here at Blush and Blood. Because the most haunting stories aren't the ones with monsters in them. They're the ones where the monster simply learned, a long time ago, how to walk among us, perfectly disguised, in a town that decided it was easier not to look too closely. Until someone finally did.